Officer, I understand your urgency, but per hospital policy, you cannot enter that room without the attending physician present.
This is ridiculous. Just get me the paperwork.
Sir, you can't go through here without a badge. Step back. The voice was firm, rehearsed, and loud enough to draw attention in the otherwise quiet hospital corridor. The man stopped mid-stride. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't defensive. He simply turned and faced the security guard standing squarely in front of the access door to the executive medical wing. "I'm Dr. Marcus Ellison," he said evenly. "Chief Medical Officer. My meeting starts in 2 minutes. I left my badge in my office." The guard didn't move. "That's not my problem," he replied. "No badge, no entry. Rules are rules." At 7:12 a.m., a ceiling-mounted camera inside Ridgeway Medical Center captured the moment a routine morning shifted into something far more serious. Nurses slowed their steps. A cart rolled past, then stopped. A pair of eyes lifted from a phone, recording quietly. Dr. Ellison gestured toward the wall-mounted scanner beside the door. "You can verify me in the system," he said. "Call administration. They'll confirm it in seconds." The guard shook his head. "That's not how this works." He stepped sideways, deliberately blocking the doorway. "You need to step back," he said again. Dr. Ellison didn't raise his voice. "I work here," he replied. "You're delaying hospital operations." The guard's expression hardened. "You should have thought about that before showing up without ID." A nurse passing by slowed, whispering, "Is that Dr. Ellison?" Another staff member stopped altogether. The hallway, once flowing, began to stall. What no one said out loud but everyone understood was that this was no longer about a missing badge. It was about authority. And within minutes, the hospital would be forced to confront a situation it could no longer ignore. The timestamp in the upper corner of the footage reads 7 hours, 12 minutes, and 43 seconds. Inside Ridgeway Medical Center, the day was already in motion. Morning rounds were underway. Operating rooms were being prepped. Executives were arriving for early briefings that would shape patient care for the rest of the week. The man standing in the hallway was Dr. Marcus Ellison, 52 years old, and he had spent nearly 2 decades inside these walls. He began his career here as an attending physician, built a reputation for calm leadership in crisis, and rose steadily through the ranks. By the time of this incident, he served as Chief Medical Officer, responsible for clinical oversight, patient safety, and the decisions that affected every department in the hospital. This morning, he was heading to a closed-door meeting on surgical capacity and staffing shortages. It was not optional. His presence mattered. The security guard blocking his path was Aaron Klein, 34, employed by a private security contractor assigned to Ridgeway's restricted zones. His post that morning was the executive corridor, a position meant to ensure access control, not create disruption. Hospital policy was clear. While visible identification was required, security officers were also trained to verify staff through internal systems when badges were unavailable, especially when patient care or executive operations were involved. That option was never used. Instead, Klein remained planted in front of the door, arms set, eyes fixed on Dr. Ellison. "No badge," he said again. "No exceptions." The camera continued to record as the gap between procedure and reality began to widen. The security guard's name was Aaron Klein. At 34 years old, he had worked hospital security for nearly 7 years, moving from one medical facility to another under the same private contracting firm. On paper, his record looked clean. No terminations, no formal discipline, nothing that would have raised alarms at first glance. But the details told a different story. Internal notes followed him quietly from site to site. Complaints that were individually dismissed, marked unsubstantiated, but repeated often enough to form a pattern. Staff had described him as rigid, quick to assert authority, and prone to escalating situations that should have ended quickly. More than once, nurses had written that interactions with Klein felt less like security and more like interrogation. Those concerns never resulted in corrective action. That morning, Klein stood at his post watching Dr. Ellison approach. "You don't look like admin," he said flatly. "Executives usually carry their badges." Dr. Ellison stopped. "That's not policy," he replied calmly. Klein didn't answer. Instead, he keyed his radio. "I've got an unbadged individual attempting access to a restricted area," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Black male." The phrasing was subtle. It was unnecessary. And it would matter later. A nurse walking past slowed. Another staff member stopped entirely. The hallway, moments ago routine, began to feel charged. Klein adjusted his stance, stepping closer to the door. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer routine security. "This is unnecessary," Dr. Ellison said, his voice steady but firm. "You're delaying hospital operations." Aaron Klein didn't step aside. "You're the one making it difficult," he replied. "All you have to do is show ID." Dr. Ellison shook his head slowly. "I've offered verification," he said. "You're choosing not to use it." Klein's jaw tightened. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." The words landed heavier than intended. They weren't about procedure anymore. They were about control. Behind them, the hallway began to change. A nurse slowed her pace, then stopped. A resident glanced over his shoulder and lingered. Someone lifted a phone, angling it low, recording without a word. Dr. Ellison noticed the growing audience but didn't raise his voice. "I'm scheduled for an executive meeting," he said. "Patient care decisions are being made right now. This delay has consequences." Klein folded his arms. "You should have thought about that before showing up without a badge." A whisper moved through the corridor. "Isn't that Dr. Ellison?" Klein noticed the attention and straightened his posture. "Everyone needs to keep moving," he said sharply. No one did. What should have ended in seconds had turned into a standoff. And with every passing moment, the line between enforcing policy and abusing authority was becoming harder to ignore. 3 minutes later, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Karen Holt, the on-duty security supervisor, stepped into the corridor with a tablet under her arm and a radio clipped to her belt. She took in the scene quickly. Aaron Klein positioned in front of the access door, a growing cluster of hospital staff nearby, and a man standing calmly with his hands at his sides. "What's going on?" she asked. Klein answered before anyone else could. "He's refusing to show ID and trying to enter a restricted area." Dr. Ellison turned toward her. "I'm Dr. Marcus Ellison," he said evenly. "Chief Medical Officer. He's refusing to verify me through the system." Holt glanced briefly at Dr. Ellison, then back at Klein. "Did you ask for his badge?" she asked. "Yes," Klein replied. "He doesn't have it." Holt nodded, as if that settled the issue. "Sir," she said, addressing Dr. Ellison, "hospital policy requires visible identification in restricted zones." Dr. Ellison exhaled slowly. "Policy also allows verification through the internal directory," he said. "You can confirm who I am in seconds." Holt hesitated. She looked at the door, then at Klein, then back at Dr. Ellison. "We still need to see ID," she said. That moment, the choice not to verify, not to de-escalate quietly, shifted everything. What had been one guard's decision was now backed by supervision, and the hallway, filled with witnesses and cameras, grew uncomfortably silent. The corridor had gone still. Where there was usually constant movement, now there was hesitation. A surgical tech leaned against the wall, pretending to scroll through her phone while listening closely. A resident stopped near a supply cart, eyes fixed on the standoff unfolding in front of him. Dr. Ellison checked his watch. "You're holding up critical operations," he said calmly. "This needs to end." Aaron Klein didn't respond. He folded his arms across his chest, widening his stance just enough to make his position unmistakable. "You're not going anywhere without ID," he said. A nurse near the wall whispered under her breath, "This is getting out of hand." Another staff member raised a phone slightly higher, no longer pretending not to record. Dr. Ellison turned toward Supervisor Holt. "This situation is unnecessary," he said. "You can resolve it right now." Holt shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following procedure," she replied. "That's not procedure," Dr. Ellison said. "That's refusal to verify." Klein cut in. "He's being argumentative." Dr. Ellison looked at him. I'm asserting that I work here, he said. There's a difference. Holt said nothing. The tension in the hallway was no longer quiet. It pressed against the walls, thick with the awareness that every second was being watched, recorded, and remembered. And still, no one chose to de-escalate. A voice cut through the tension from the far end of the corridor. What's going on here? Heads turned almost in unison. James Whitaker, the hospital's chief executive officer, stepped out from an adjacent hallway, a folder tucked under his arm. He had arrived early for a leadership briefing and immediately sensed that something was wrong. Meetings stopped when hallways stopped moving. Whitaker took in the scene quickly. The blocked access door, the gathered staff, Aaron Klein standing rigidly in front of Dr. Ellison. His eyes narrowed. "Why is this hallway shut down?" he asked. Supervisor Holt spoke first. "Badge compliance issue," she said. "He doesn't have ID." Whitaker turned to Dr. Ellison. "Marcus?" he asked. "I've identified myself," Dr. Ellison replied calmly. "They're refusing to verify." Whitaker looked back at Holt, then at Klein. "That's not how this works," he said flatly. "Verification is standard." Klein opened his mouth. "Sir, protocol. Protocol is resolution," Whitaker interrupted. "Not a standoff." The corridor went silent. Whitaker didn't raise his voice. "Step aside," he said. Klein hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, he moved away from the door. Dr. Ellison walked forward without a word and passed through the access point. Behind him, the hallway seemed to exhale all at once, but no one looked relieved, because everyone understood the same thing. This wasn't over. It had just been witnessed. By mid-morning, the incident was no longer confined to the hallway. Security leadership had already pulled the footage from the ceiling cameras. Timestamps were cross-checked. Radio transmissions were logged. Cell phone videos recorded by staff were quietly requested and preserved. What those recordings showed was consistent. The block, the refusal to verify, the escalation. Aaron Klein was instructed to step off post before his shift ended. His radio was collected. His access credentials were suspended pending review. No explanations were given, only instructions. Supervisor Karen Holt was asked to submit a written statement and surrender her shift log. She wasn't told what consequences might follow. Inside the administration wing, meetings replaced meetings. Human resources sat with legal. Legal sat with risk management. The question was no longer what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. An internal notice went out to department heads before noon. It acknowledged a security-related incident involving hospital leadership and confirmed that a formal review was underway. Names were not mentioned. Details were avoided. It didn't matter. Word had already spread. Staff who had witnessed the standoff replayed it quietly among themselves. The cameras had captured everything, and everyone understood the same thing. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a documented incident. Formal interviews began that same afternoon. Aaron Klein was the first to be questioned. Seated in a small conference room, he framed the encounter as a matter of control. In his written statement, he emphasized that the individual had refused to comply and that he had simply enforced access policy. What he did not mention was verification. When investigators asked why he hadn't checked the internal directory or contacted administration, Klein hesitated. "He didn't give me a reason to trust him," he said. The room went quiet. That sentence was written down exactly as spoken. Supervisor Karen Holt's interview followed. Her statement was shorter, more careful. She cited policy language and deferred responsibility downward. When asked why she didn't verify Dr. Ellison after being directly requested to do so, she paused. "I didn't want to undermine my officer in front of staff," she said. That answer raised its own concerns. Neither statement mentioned race. Neither acknowledged the growing crowd, the cameras, or the impact on hospital operations. But together, the interviews revealed something the footage already suggested. This wasn't confusion. It was a series of choices, and those choices were now part of the record. Once the initial statements were collected, the scope of the review widened. Human Resources pulled Aaron Klein's full personnel file. What appeared uneventful at first began to change under closer inspection. There were no formal write-ups, no suspensions, no terminations, but there were notes, quiet entries attached to prior transfers, complaints that had been closed without action. Individually, each one had been easy to dismiss. Collectively, they told a different story. Several referenced unnecessary escalation. Others mentioned a dismissive tone. A few described selective enforcement of rules, particularly toward black staff members. None of those complaints had ever triggered corrective training or oversight. Now they were being read together for the first time. Legal counsel requested additional records. Training logs were reviewed. Radio communications from the incident were transcribed verbatim. The phrase used to describe Dr. Ellison over the radio was flagged and set aside for separate analysis. At the same time, administrators began examining their own systems. Why had earlier complaints gone nowhere? Why had a supervisor reinforced a standoff instead of resolving it? Where had oversight failed? The investigation was no longer about one guard or one hallway. It was about whether the institution itself had allowed a pattern to exist unnoticed or unchallenged for far too long. What happened in the corridor did not stay inside the hospital. One of the staff videos recorded that morning just seconds of silent footage, showing a security guard blocking an executive hallway while doctors and nurses looked on, was shared privately first, then forwarded again. By that evening, the clip had reached medical professionals outside Ridgeway Medical Center. Comments appeared beneath it in group chats and forums. Questions followed almost immediately. Why wasn't he verified? Why was access blocked for so long? Why did no one step in sooner? The hospital issued a brief internal message before the end of the day. It acknowledged a security-related incident involving a senior staff member and confirmed that an internal investigation was underway. No names were released. No explanations were offered. It didn't slow the conversation. By the next morning, local reporters had contacted the hospital's communications office, asking about a video involving hospital security and leadership. The hospital declined interviews, but confirmed that the matter was under review. Inside Ridgeway, staff reactions hardened. Nurses began submitting written complaints of their own, some referencing past interactions with Aaron Klein. Others spoke openly about what the incident signaled. One message circulated quietly among departments. "If it can happen to him," it read, "it can happen to any of us." At that point, there was no doubt left. The situation had escalated beyond control. 6 weeks after the incident, the internal review was formally closed. By then, the investigation had moved well beyond the events of that single morning. Independent reviewers examined security protocols, training materials, hallway footage, radio transcripts, and prior complaints that had never been addressed. They interviewed staff who had been present in the corridor, as well as others who had interacted with Aaron Klein in the past. The findings were clear. Policy had been violated. Required verification procedures were not used. An encounter that should have ended quickly was escalated without cause. The report stated that discretion had been misapplied and that personal bias influenced decision-making. Race was addressed directly. Investigators concluded that enforcement patterns disproportionately targeted black staff members, a finding supported by witness testimony and historical complaints. The language used over the radio during the incident was described as inaccurate and prejudicial. The report also criticized supervisory oversight. It found that Karen Holt failed to intervene when resolution was both available and necessary, choosing instead to reinforce the escalation. This was no longer a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a documented failure by individuals and by the system that allowed them to act unchecked. The response came quickly once the findings were finalized. Within days of the report's release, Aaron Klein's employment was terminated. His security credentials were revoked, and his contracting firm removed him from all hospital assignments effective immediately. He would not return to Ridgeway Medical Center or any affiliated facility. Supervisor Karen Holt was placed under disciplinary review. She was later reassigned from supervisory duties and required to complete additional training focused on de-escalation and bias awareness. The decision was described internally as corrective, but the message was clear. At the institutional level, Ridgeway Medical Center issued a formal statement acknowledging that the incident involving Dr. Marcus Ellison should never have occurred. The hospital confirmed that he had been wrongfully blocked from accessing a critical work area and that proper procedures had not been followed. Mandatory retraining was ordered for all security staff. New oversight measures were implemented, including real-time administrative verification for access disputes and expanded documentation requirements for any escalated encounters. These changes were not presented as optional improvements. They were framed as necessary corrections, because the cost of ignoring what happened both legally and ethically had become impossible to deny. While the hospital addressed the internal fallout, Dr. Marcus Ellison remained silent publicly. He returned to his duties, attended meetings, and continued overseeing clinical operations as if nothing had happened. But behind the scenes, he took a different step. He retained outside legal counsel. The civil complaint was filed quietly in county court, naming both Ridgeway Medical Center and the private security contractor. The lawsuit alleged racial discrimination, false detention, emotional distress, and interference with professional duties. It cited video footage, radio transcripts, internal investigation findings, and witness testimony. The claim was not framed as a misunderstanding or an isolated error. It described a pattern of conduct that allowed authority to be misused without accountability. The lawsuit did not ask for reinstatement, apologies, or public statements. It asked for responsibility. As discovery began, internal emails and personnel records were prepared for disclosure. Legal teams on both sides understood the risk. What had already been documented internally would not play well under public scrutiny. Negotiations began almost immediately, because once the case moved beyond the hospital walls, control over the narrative was gone. Less than 3 months after the lawsuit was filed, the case was resolved. There was no courtroom showdown, no jury selection, no opening statements. Behind closed doors, both sides reached an agreement that made one thing unmistakably clear: the cost of what happened in that hallway was no longer theoretical. The settlement amount was $2.5 million. The agreement included financial compensation for Dr. Marcus Ellison, but it went further than money. Ridgeway Medical Center committed to additional policy reforms, expanded bias training, and independent monitoring of its security practices for a defined period of time. While the settlement did not require a formal admission of liability, the hospital acknowledged that Dr. Ellison's civil rights had been violated. That acknowledgement was written into the agreement. When news of the settlement became public, the reaction was immediate. Medical associations referenced the case in discussions about workplace equity. Civil rights organizations cited it as an example of how unchecked authority can cause real harm, even inside institutions built to protect life. Inside Ridgeway, the message was impossible to miss. A single decision, a series of refusals, and a price measured not just in dollars, but in credibility. The hallway incident was no longer just an internal failure. It was a public record. After the settlement, life inside Ridgeway Medical Center returned to its routine rhythm. Dr. Marcus Ellison did not hold a press conference. He did not give interviews. He did not seek attention. He returned to his office, resumed meetings, and continued making decisions that affected patient care every single day. Colleagues noticed a shift not in him, but around him. Security interactions became quieter, quicker, more careful. Verification was no longer optional. Supervisors stepped in sooner. Authority was exercised with restraint instead of suspicion. When Dr. Ellison was later asked, privately, why he chose to pursue the case, his answer was brief. "This wasn't about the money," he said. "It was about making sure this doesn't happen again." The hallway where it all began looks exactly the same today. Same doors, same badge scanners, same camera mounted above the ceiling tile, recording every movement. But the record remains. A routine morning, a series of choices, and consequences that followed because they had to. So, here's the question worth asking. What do you think would have happened if there were no cameras? No witnesses slowing their steps? No phones quietly recording? No power strong enough to push back? Was justice served here? Or does accountability only appear when institutions are forced to confront themselves? Share your thoughts below and follow for the next story.